Tom apparently didn't realise what the result of rewarding Jackalope for stealing his gun was likely to be. The Nook and a Puma had just looked at each other and sighed when they found out. A Puma had actually come to have a go on the bike. The result was the slowest moving dragonette Sapphire had seen since Fengi was put on pen cleaning duty for losing her knife that one time. Still, it was an amusing sight. Following recent events, the Nook had called another little meeting, this time with Tom attending, and with far less secrecy. First on the docket was convincing Jackalope that being allowed to ride the quad bike didn't mean she was pardoned from her theft. Dakota had just shrugged. She was more than used to dealing with Jackalope, and in the end, they all knew she could be depended upon, not to mention she would always give things back once she had gone to play with them, assuming she didn't break it, of course. The usual fix of just letting her try out the thing she was eyeing wouldn't work here, though. As such, Rachuk and the Nook decided to let Jackalope know that if she stole something from Tom again, they would be forced to make her pay reparation. Tom looked a little worried at this notion. After having confirmed she had no chance of actually paying for most of the things Tom owned, she slackheadedly agreed to keep her fingers to herself. Sapphire just hoped the notion of being forever in Tom's debt would do the trick. Tom seemed happy with the arrangement, not to mention he had a locked room to put things in now. Tom, what was the revolver she stole worth back where you were from? Esmeralda had asked. I pay 7,000 Danish crowns for it. I have no clue what that is in your currency. Right, that was a bit of a problem, she could see that. The Nook seemed to take an interest in this, though. What would a gold coin be worth? We don't have those. I'll check if I have value of gold somewhere, I can't remember. A kilo of gold is worth a lot though, like 300,000 to 400,000. Yikes, those are some big numbers. I weighed your coins, there's 150 coins in the kilo, so... Tom pulled out the little thing he had used to take her picture in the forest, and tapped on it a bit. The revolver would be around 3 gold. Oh, was all the Nook could say at that. 3 gold? Seriously? A weapon that could lay low a black knight and cut through darklings with contemptuous ease, and it cost just 3 gold coins. Gold is very valuable to my people, Tom tried. You could say that twice. What Sapphire wouldn't give for a shopping trip in one of their big cities if gold was worth this much. She might even sell her necklace to them and buy a whole armory. A loaf of bread worth around 20 crowns for reference, so around 100 loaves of bread for 1 gold. She remembered paying around 5 copper for a loaf of bread in the capital. Right then, time for some math. 100 copper in a gold coin, so that was 20 loaves for 1 gold. That made it 5 times cheaper. She was getting better at this. She still wanted to go shopping there. She wouldn't just be buying bread though, that was for sure. She wondered what kind of clothes they could make. While the lesson on economics is very fascinating, we do have other matters to attend to. Besides, I highly doubt you would take 3 gold for your revolver now, would you? The Nook questioned. Nope, Tom just answered bluntly, which was understandable. Very well then. It has reached my ear you met Celestine. I hope your encounter was pleasant? Sapphire knew the Nook was perfectly aware of exactly how it had gone already. Wounded and weak as she was, there was no way she had let this slide during dinner or breakfast. Sapphire answered. She wasn't too pleased with the noise we were making, the large amount of deer we killed, the fact there might be a dragon on the way, or the fact that there had been darklings on the island. That was a bit of a list of grievances, come to think of it. But she was very pleased that we managed to repel the darklings, not to mention kill a dark knight, so she concluded we had done our duty as best we could. She even gave her blessing for Tom to traverse her woods. Sapphire did her best to try and sound optimistic on the last parts. Even if the list of good was a bit shorter, she did feel that killing a dark knight more than made up for being a little noisy. That's good, though I must admit I had hoped for a bit of praise following those battles. However, she was never one for showing gratitude, I guess. Tom put his hand in the air like one of those kids in class, scoring a few headshakes around the room. Yes, Tom? The Nook went in her best mum voice. They can teleport and read minds, right? Yes, Tom, they can. Is it also true unicorn blood can cure death? Oh, and what about the horns? There was complete silence, broken only by Heron dropping a knife he was playing with. Tom visibly recoiled, clearly figuring out that hadn't been the smartest thing to ask. How could he even ask that? They weren't just some prey. Didn't mean kill, just like I did with the Nook, only blood and going out instead of in. The Nook leaned forward in her chair, eyes narrowed. You better. There is no higher crime in our book of laws than to harm a unicorn. They are the embodiment of a pure soul. The noblest creatures this world has ever spawned. Not to mention our deal with them has stood for centuries, if not millennia. To threaten them is to threaten our entire people. A puma joined in. Understood. Didn't want to kill, Tom tried, before being cut off by the Nook. Nor will you attempt to steal its blood to satisfy your curiosity. A clear point in her voice. Not that he could if he wanted to. Dakota joined in, sounding a bit more reasonable. It's not like she would just give you some, so you would have to hurt her to get it. That will not be allowed to happen. By now, Tom had his arms up in the air. Nope, didn't mean to hurt her, just curious, that's all. Sapphire was beginning to wonder just how like Jackalope Tom was turning out to be. She had seen that particular maneuver more than once before. Still, she prayed this was a promise he was going to keep. There was nothing worse than having to hunt down a friend. She did like him after all. The hall settled after a bit. At least Kullinger hadn't been here, Sapphire thought. That would have been a real shit show. Sorry, didn't mean to kill you, no. He did look genuinely sorry to Sapphire. It was clear to her he had more questions. It wasn't likely he was going to ask them now, though. Nanook seemed satisfied her point had been made, as she leaned back in her chair with a bit of a wince. That had been a fairly extreme reaction. He had suspected they really liked the unicorns, but still. He hadn't witnessed such hostility from them directed to him. That was a bit of a wake-up call. Don't go around asking someone if the blood of their holy creature would cure death. It was a bit like the most extreme version of asking an Indian if they served beef, he guessed. It didn't matter though, it wasn't like he could get a hold of any. The conversation had continued on the point of what preparations needed to be done to make ready for Jarrett's possible arrival, as well as how Tom's projects were coming along. In the end, the plan was for them to start work on the distillery right away. Meanwhile, he got to work on what parts of the lathe he could. For starters, he would be focusing on the motor to drive it. If he couldn't get that to work, he would need to start over anyway. They would hold off on making more boats for now, at least until the distillery was completed. That suited Tom just fine. He was kind of hoping Sapphire could use the time to work out if there was any way to improve the boat to better suit their needs. Shiva seemed a bit perturbed by the amount of work in her immediate future. She had just gotten started on recycling the armour and weapons of the Darklings that were too badly damaged or poorly maintained to want restoring. She had been soothed a bit by learning Tom needed time to work out designs for everything first, before she was expected to start hammering out the large amount of plate needed. All in all, the meeting had been a rather unpleasant experience. He would have to be a bit more careful in the future. He was starting to get to terms with their rather different take on religion. It was clear that just because they didn't sing songs or do much praying, didn't mean they weren't religious. With the rather unpleasant experience dealt with, things had carried on as before. Tom was back to working his duties. The kids, of course, had a lot of questions concerning Celestine. They had clearly all heard stories before, so Tom wasn't entirely sure what to say. He described her for them and tried to liven up the story a bit for their sake. He didn't want to add besmudging the name of a god or holy creature to the list. He did give in to the demand to try and draw her. He just hoped the typical Danish luck when it came to drawing religious figures didn't bite him in the ass on this one. He had started with the distillery. That was something they could likely figure out by themselves once he got them going. Luckily for him, he had bought some designs that he had obtained totally legally before departing. It wasn't like copyrights or patents were a concern here anyway. He had brought both digital and analog thermometers as well, so he didn't need to worry about that particular bit of mental gymnastics for the time being. Still, he needed to figure out a way of heating very smoothly and accurately if he wanted something more than just high-proof spirits. He went for a water bath with a stir in it. That way you could pour in a bit of cold or hot water to adjust the temperature with a fire, providing most of the heating. He did also consider trying to make methanol from some of the wood they had chopped down. The challenge of making an engine run on that stuff was just not worth it in his book though. As for all the deer, the Huntresses were hard at work salting and drying the meat for long-term storage. Tom had no clue how they made salt this easily, with the ocean being a fair ways down, but it was apparently cheap. Their supplies of salt had also recently been refilled following Volson's visit as part of the supplies they had wanted. They also smoked a substantial amount of meat, mostly turning it into little snacks or thin strips. The skins were set to cure in vats in the tanning hut. that being the building furthest away from the keep. Tom had never tried curing leather before, but he had heard it would stink. He was not disappointed. He had gone down to ask Esmeralda if she knew where Holdy's toy wooden dragon had gone. As soon as he had made sure she didn't know, he had bolted for the door. Good God, that stank. In other news, his joint design/storytime class was now consisting of just as many adults as children. In the end, he made a deal with the Puma to start holding science classes every other day for the adults. That way he could actually take care of the kids and manage a bit of design work. Raoulf in particular had enjoyed when he set about explaining the distillery he was planning. It was clear the farmer was a bit of a beer enthusiast, but the thought of being able to make this whiskey clearly intrigued him. Tom had settled on making a reflux still. Shiva had managed to convince him she could make the tanks and pipes out of steel. She was an armorsmith after all, so he believed her. He just hoped the thing wouldn't rust of them. He didn't have what was needed for stainless steel, and copper was also limited. Shiva had questioned him extensively on what stainless steel was, so he went about another round of explaining. The notion of steel which didn't rust resulted in a fresh round of accusations of Tom not admitting to knowing magic, since that apparently sounded like mithril to her. He had convinced her in the end that it was just a matter of alloying in a lot of chrome. She had of course immediately demanded to know what chrome was. That one stumped him for a bit before he tried to explain it was another kind of metal. The fact they didn't have any, and that he didn't really have any idea where to get some, was a bit of a bummer. That had inevitably evolved into her demanding to know how many metals Tom knew about. The amount of joy and sadness the old smith went through was almost heartbreaking. The notion of there being so many metals she never even knew about, and having her hopes smashed by Tom admitting he had no real way of making any of it locally, was almost too much to bear. In the end, he resorted to making the next science class about metallurgy. Hopefully they could figure out something useful for her after that particular disappointment. The steel had been a rather simple task to design, since he was basically stealing the whole thing. His new workshop provided the perfect place to get out the laptop for the first time, with the door locked, of course. He didn't need to explain this one yet. He got out the files and started copying them down by hand for Shiva to start work. There were naturally also other things in the laptop. It had been a while, after all. It had only taken Tom a few days to produce a set of plans for the distillery. An impressive feat, she thought, judging by the detail of them. She knew he didn't need as much sleep as them, but she was starting to worry if he was getting what he needed. If he was tired, she couldn't tell though, so it was probably nothing to worry about. He had explained it on the blackboard during science class. It was actually a rather simple device for once, even if the fact alcohol boiled at a lower temperature than water was news to her. The notion things could get colder than freezing and not freeze was a bit of a brain turner though. As with so many other things, she just accepted it as the truth, and worried about what she needed to understand. She had long since given up trying to understand everything. Shiva seemed to be of the same mindset, only worrying about what she needed to know to make all the metal components. Raoulf and Apuma, though, kept on trying to understand what Tom was on about, leading to a lot of sidetracking. More than once the girls had to put a stop to them, so they could get back on topic. It didn't help Tom was more than willing to just keep talking. Still, it was easier to stay awake for this than his classes on math. Dakota and Apuma had taken her place on that front. She instead spent that time either working around the keep or covering for Tom as a nanny. From what she figured out, they were making a lot of progress rather swiftly. She hadn't seen Apuma this stressed in years. In fact, she even caught him looking through papers at dinner once. It would seem Dakota was cheering up a bit too, even if she did complain a bit about Tom being too good at math for it to be natural, not to mention the odd rant about things not making sense. When she had shown Sapphire the problem she couldn't understand, Sapphire had just chuckled nervously. She had no clue what she was looking at apart from the symbols being English, that was. It would appear Tom won the argument over what to use then. Unlike with the bow, there wasn't much for Sapphire to do when it came to making the distillery. It was mostly metalwork, so she elected to sharpen up her skills a bit instead. It was only another week before the Nook had promised her she would be allowed to use her wings again after all. Besides, she wanted to get in a few more shots with her new bow. Tom had given it to her after all and didn't seem too concerned with who used it, so she might as well claim the privilege. She had spent an afternoon on the range with the guards as they were doing their training. She could of course outshoot them all even with her regular bow, but with this, it was child's play. They had of course all been allowed to have a go, or been astonished by how easy it was to shoot, even if some of them struggled to draw it. Unkai in particular didn't have the draw length to get to the easy part, which was a little sad. The funny thing, though, was that once it was drawn out, it was easy. So she would just help them with the hard part, and then they could get to shoot a much heavier bow than they had any chance of on their own. She did promise to ask Tom to design a more man-friendly version in the future, with a bit of a snicker. Needing help to draw your bow was not a brilliant way of going about it in combat, after all. The only bummer was that her old bow, made of its finely bleached and dyed wood, was a lot prettier than this weird contraption. Perhaps she should be the one to receive the first proper one as well. Tom would call this one a prototype, after all. It apparently meant not quite finished, but good enough. There was something cool about having the first one ever made of something, though. Perhaps she could get this one spruced up instead.